Remote and flexible working are changing the landscape of where and how we work, especially after COVID-19 pandemic. Does it mean the end of the office? Well, research suggests that nearly 50% of our jobs are likely to be automated. Does it mean that robots will take our jobs? And should our jobs prevail in some form, how will remoteness, flexibility, and automation impact our workspaces and the ways in which they are managed? This talk is focused on three salient trends in the context of work: automation, flexibility, and reshaping of workspaces, with a view to reflect on those trends and on their potential to shape the future of work in its many guises. The focus is not really on giving answers. Please bear in mind that I'm an academic and we don't give straightforward answers anyway. But instead on posing questions and explaining why giving quick and easy answers to some of those questions is not always the best way forward. First theme, mobility and flexibility of work. Of course, the phenomenon is not new. Already in the 1970s, telecommuting, as it was called back then, was hailed in the US as a response to increasing commuting costs, which raised due to increased costs of petrol at the time. But what is relatively new now is the combination of consistent spatial distancing from the office, often accompanied by temporal distancing. So working hours can be extended or shortened, and in addition, accompanied by the use of technology, often intensive use. But what is flexible mobile working? Well, it is about working from the distance, at least partly, from home, on the move, from a so-called third place, like a cafe. It's also about being given some freedom from direct managerial and peer control, and to gain the ability to manage your working hours more autonomously. It may, and typically does mean, better work-life balance. It may, and typically does, mean that companies are able to better deal with competitive pressure and possible unexpected disruptions. This is also where the greatest job growth is today, in jobs that move beyond the boundary of the firm. In fact, already before the pandemic, in certain countries such as Netherlands and some Scandinavian countries, quite a few employees were able to enjoy certain flexibility and mobility embedded in their work schedules. But since COVID pandemic struck, the turn to flexible working was, of course, massive. In one study from the UK, most managers reported that while less than 20% of employees were working flexibly before COVID, during the pandemics, over 80% of them were. We need to acknowledge that non-negligible number of companies, temporarily at least, are actually turning away from flexible working. That's true. Major companies such as Facebook or Meta, Twitter or X once projected that most of their workforce will be able to work remotely within a decade. But now both of them crack down on remote work, citing the need to build necessary connections, because apparently there's just no substitute for coming together in person. Well, is it really necessary to build connections that way? And are there really no substitutes for in-person connection? Well, yes, water cooler meetings have a certain charm, and serendipitous meetings at the office corridors are cherished by some, yes. But to balance it out, research shows that teams under high time pressure do not benefit from close proximity. So simply reducing physical distances is unlikely to promote communication or collaboration. Another study found that, contrary to popular belief, an open office design can trigger a natural human response to socially withdraw from the office mates and interact instead over email. So at a certain point, the closer we get together, the less talkative we become, it seems. So where does it leave us with regards to the future of flexible mobile work? Well, altogether one can be quite positive about it. Europeans show a strong preference for some form of flexibility, with 60% of them reporting that they would prefer to work from home at least several times per month. A global survey of 5,000 employees confirmed that pre- and post-pandemic preferences of employees have significantly changed. The proportion of employees who would prefer to work flexibly in some measure increased from 30 to 50%, so very considerably. Flex workers are also less likely to report poor work-life balance. 13% of flex workers versus 18% of those working from corporate premises. Globally, most surveys indicate that mobile and flex working arrangements increase productivity, whether self-reported or reported by the employers. One survey found that 9 out of 10 people felt that they got more or just as much done at home as they did at work. 7 out of 10 people who responded to the survey wanted to continue working from home. Okay, to balance it out, flexible working has its issues too. Firstly, the extent to which jobs can be made flexible is riddled with inequalities. For example, think of a work performed by a janitor versus that performed by a knowledge worker. Very different degrees of flexibility are possible in those two cases. Also, if the use of ICT is very intensive, it may lead to work intensification too, and as a result, to worse work-life balance. So the more ICT intensive it is, the less beneficial to work-life balance it becomes. Crucially, confusion regarding what is meant by flexibility and flexibility for whom is possible. Is it flexibility for an organization, for an employee, or of an organization, of an employee? Who profits from it? Who initiates it? This leads to very different meanings of flexibility, as Professor Matthijs Bal and myself claimed in a recent paper. But overall, research points towards the future of work being increasingly spatiotemporally extended, flexible, and hybrid. The second theme is space, because space will be shaping the future of work too. How we imagine and enact spaces in which we work is undergoing a profound change as we speak. Firstly, organizational space. Due to increased flexibility and mobility of work, the new world of work, or NWOW for short, emerges with its so-called activity-based flexible workspaces, meaning that organizational spaces are explicitly designed for different work activities, such as open workstations, breakout rooms, quiet rooms, meeting rooms, collaboration zones, relaxation zones, and other. Secondly, home space. COVID enforced extended exercise in mobile, flexible, and often home working also meant reimagining our home workspaces. We were thrust into appropriating dining rooms as classrooms and kitchen tables as meeting rooms. What was once private was made partly public, and the boundaries between work and home have been compromised. I promise that's my only cat picture for the day. As we argue in a recent publication with Harriet Short, this makes the home a contested space. Spaces with multiple meanings and in which competing interests play out. Just think of loaves of bread, pets, laptops, children, schoolwork, garden hammocks, all of it sitting next to work. This shows the complexities of working from home and juggling and mixing everything. I do mean everything, because post-COVID-19 world might mean that previously formal relationships where bringing emotions and life to work were discouraged will now be modified and contain an appreciation of the mess, struggle, and the balance of everyday life. This is a double-edged sword, though, because this new wave of visibility meant, as well, that lots of people have been invited in, including those we would never choose to invite into our homes, strangers, maybe certain work colleagues, and others. Finally, as regards space, we cannot forget about virtual space, because numerous virtual reality work meeting tools and applications appear. Spatial, Meeting VR, Glue, and others, where meetings are entirely virtual and use avatars, with all the issues discussed above now being potentially transported into a virtual space. This raises questions. Will being able to hide behind an avatar make the human contact less genuine or not? How will virtualization of work affect strategies to establish authority and power, for example? So will it simply mean a translation of existing attributes to the virtual world? So if you have a corner office in the real world, will you seek to recreate it in a virtual one? Those are fascinating questions, I think, and only time and research can reveal answers to them. Last, but certainly not least, automation will be a crucial factor shaping the future of work. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes said that due to technological progress automating much of human labor, by 2030, that's 6 years from now, we could all enjoy a 15-hour working week. He added, however, there is no country and no people who can look forward to the age of leisure and of abundance without a dread. Are we then in danger of having to comprehend the reality of not working? Well, OECD estimates that within the next 15 to 20 years, 14% of jobs are at a high risk of automation, meaning they could basically disappear. And another 32% are likely to change radically as individual tasks are automated. According to McKinsey Institute, around half of current jobs in the UK and US could be automated in the near future. In another study, 57% of jobs in the OECD were found to be susceptible to mechanization in the next 20 years, 69% in India, 77% in China. What these findings jointly point towards is the fact that almost half the activities people are paid $16 trillion globally in wages have the potential to be automated by adapting the already existing technology. However, the spread of automation is uneven. The risk of automation is often falling on low-educated workers, and the COVID-19 might have actually exacerbated this. Moreover, unlike past modes of automation which centered on repetitive manual work, highly cognitive jobs are now vulnerable too. For example, coding jobs or paralegal jobs. Currently, software exists that can sift through documents, identify any relevant precedents, and put together the case using a simple formula with no humans being involved. Moreover, certain low and middle skilled jobs we presumed were too human to automate, such as hairdressers, waiters, may now also be at risk. Few occupations are candidates for full automation today, but almost every occupation has partial automation potential, as a significant percentage of its activities could be automated. Take switchboard operators and dishwashers on the one hand. Here the potential for full automation is real. But take the clergy and take the magistrates on the other hand. Much more difficult to imagine how those could be automated, right? Well, meet the robot priest, who already conducts Buddhist teachings in one of the Japanese temples as we speak. Yet, and here is where it gets really interesting, automation is bounded. I borrowed this notion of bounded automation from a recent paper written by Peter Fleming. What it means is that it is not technology that determines employment patterns. It is the other way around. In other words, whether the robots will replace us or not depends less on robots and more on two factors: the pricing of labor and the nature of the task itself. Firstly, pricing of labor. Well, contrarily to a popular belief, inequality may not render workers more vulnerable to robotic automation, but less so. Because firms are not only asking whether a job can be mechanized, they ask whether it is economically viable, given the human cheap labor alternative. This person has the worst job in the world. He's a sewage pipe diver in New Delhi, India. He's spending several hours a day submerged in human waste to clear the blockages, dressed only in his underwear. Given the cost at which he sells his labor, which is equivalent to about £3.50 a day, automating his job is unlikely to be economically viable in the foreseeable future. Secondly, the task itself. Think about the call centers. It was said long ago that call centers could completely replace human customer service providers with robots of some sort. It never happened. There are literally millions of people employed in call centers in the UK and US jointly. Why? Because at least in certain situations, customers just cannot do without a living person on the other end of the line. Imagine that you suspect your bank account being compromised by hackers. Would you be happy to speak to a robot then? More food for thought. It is now perfectly possible to create a fully autonomous commercial airplane with no humans involved at any point. But would you be happy to hop on a fully automated, cockpitless airplane? I would not. So, we often confuse the AI's potential to replace jobs with its empirical feasibility. The gap between what is technologically possible and what is commercially and socially viable is larger than often imagined. Automation, mechanization work in protracted ways. They can reduce employment in certain sectors, yes, but they can equally shift the employment downwards to those jobs which are just too cheap to be mechanized. Overall, automation will surely be a factor shaping the future of work, but more selectively and likely more slowly than we typically think. To conclude, how can we then imagine convergence of these three dimensions? Mobility and flexibility on the one hand, automation and spatial rearrangement in terms of shaping the future of work. Well, here your guess is just as good as mine. But my Pennyworth prophecy would be to imagine the following picture. A knowledge worker operating a virtual touchscreen during his time off from his holiday home, not because he was told to, but either because he wants to or believes he may be expected to, is eerily regarded by his cat, uneasily attempting to sit on his lap. And behind him, we see a large bay window. And through this window, we see a large garden. And we see an even larger pool in this garden. And we see a pool cleaner in his worn overalls, conducting his time and space-bound job, as he always did, and as he likely will continue to do so. After all, the best projection of the future is founded in today's reality. Remember, I only promised a reflection, not an answer, and certainly not a utopia. Thank you.